Hello YouTube, this is Umozo3. So now we're on to lesson 3 of our Python programming curriculum. And in the first 3 videos, now if you include lesson 0, remember in lesson 0 what we did was we downloaded the PyCharm IDE, and we said that an integrated development is a special software program that's used to write code in a particular programming language. And so the focus of these videos is going to be in Python. So we needed to identify an integrated development environment that was going to enable us to write Python code. And we said PyCharm is a good one, and so there's some nice features and functionality, and so hopefully I've been demonstrating a little bit of that to you in the first couple of videos. In lesson 1, we got comfortable printing statements, and so we said something like, you know, it's okay to go ahead and print statements either with single quotes or double quotes, right? And then we basically discussed comments, and we said that you can start a comment in Python by doing a hashtag, okay? And one of the things we learned from PEP 8, one of the things we learned about the way the etiquette works in Python is that a comment doesn't just start with a hashtag, but it starts with a hashtag and then a space. So then if you just go ahead and write comment there, it would say, well, maybe you just want to give one space between the hashtag and the comment. But that's just something that you can either choose to accept or ignore. And you say, maybe I don't have an issue with that, and then it wouldn't be a problem. And then if you hover over it, then it'll tell you what the issue is, and it'll give you more options for what you want to do with that. So you can either reformat the file, in which case you would just be adding a space, or you can choose to ignore errors like that. Okay, so this would be reformatting, but then what if we had decided to ignore an error like that? So now if we go ahead and hover back over it and we press more actions again, we could ignore errors, and then suddenly it's not going to take an issue with a comment like that. So it's up to you whether or not you want PEP 8 to get in your way, essentially. But then, yeah, we were talking about comments and printing statements, right? And so we already know that we just write print, and then we're going to either have single or double quotes, and we know how to print what's called a string. A string is basically a set of words or letters. It's a collection of characters. It's an array of characters, a list of characters. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say the word string. And we're going to be saying string probably in every single programming video for the rest of the curriculum. And then in lesson 2, we started talking about arithmetic expressions, and we said that not only can Python, you know, ignore comments and print statements, which is totally awesome, but it can also do arithmetic expressions. So we're just going to review those briefly. And then in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about strings and combining strings and escape sequences and printing multiple lines and combining strings and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about strings, you know, a little bit more about string characterizations, but we're not going to actually start creating variables until the next lesson. So anyway, let's just review a couple of the things that we've already seen. So if you do 70 plus 10, of course, Java knows how to interpret this, right? So print of 70 plus 10, and of course, that would give us the 80. And then, of course, obviously, we can do multiplication too. So we've already seen this, right? Print of 70 times 10 is 700, right? Print of 70 minus 10 would be 60, right? We said, what if you do 70 over 10? Okay, so this is a perfect division, and 70 divided by 10, that's exactly 7 full groups of 10 in the number 70. But we said Python, if you do one number divided by another number, it will always return a double. It will always return a floating point number, even if the division would have been perfect. Okay, so that's the difference. That's the difference. If you say something like 5 divided by 2, right? 5 over 2, think about that. In Java, they would just say 2. Okay, there's 2 full groups of 2 and the number 5. In Python, that they would say 2.5. Okay, but then with 6 divided by 2, Java would just say 3. Python would say 3.0. So now if you go ahead and run this code, you get the perfect floating point representation of that division. And so, you know, Python prefers the doubles over the ints, and you could see that with other examples too. So if you do 5 times 2.0, you don't get 10, you get 10.0. So hopefully that's clear to you how that's working, right? And then what we did is we talked about an exponential. So remember one of the things we said is that a times b returns a to the b and gives an integer if and only if both a and b are integers. Okay, so if you say something like print of 600 to the 1 power, well, 600 to the 1 power, what's 600 multiplied by itself one time, right? It'd just be 600. But then if you go ahead and say something like, what is the square root of 100? Okay, so what is the square root of 100? So the 1 over 2, Python's going to evaluate that to be 0.5, and that's a floating point number. So now 100 to the 0.5, it's not going to be 10, even though 10 is the square root of 100, it will be 10.0 because it's going to return a floating point representation because 1 over 2 is not an integer. So hopefully that's clear to you how that works. And then what we can do is we can also think about perfect integer division. So an int divided by an int is an int in Java by default. In Python, we can do, integer division, integer-based division, simply by doing a over b for two ints a and b. Okay, so if you say print of 83 mod divided by 20, it's going to say how many full groups of 20 are there in the number 83, and of course there'll be 4. And then if you convert one of these numbers to a floating point number, so what if you said 20 plus 0.0? What does that do? Well, the 20 plus 0.0, the 20 is going to be converted to a floating point number. So 20.0 plus 0.0 is 20.0. And then you're doing integer-based division, but one of the numbers in your arguments is a floating point number. So you're going to get a floating point representation of the integer-based division. So that's why you get the 4.0 there. Sorry for all the sound effects. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about modular arithmetic. So we said, what if you wanted to find the remainder when one number is divided by another number? And so we said that we can do that with a percent sign. So then one of the things we said in the previous lesson, remember this is all review and we want to talk about new things in this video sooner or later. But we said a mod b returns the result, the remainder, when a is divided by b. Okay, and so what this would do is this works for floating point numbers as well. If either a or b is a float, then the result will be a float. So let me show you what I mean by that, right? So you could say something like print of 52 mod 10, and that would return the remainder when 52 is divided by 10. And of course, the last thing that we're going to want to see printed on the console is that 2 there. But then if you go ahead and make either of those numbers a floating point number, instead of getting 2, you'd get 2.0. And it would work regardless. So what if you said 52.8 mod 10? What's the remainder when I divide 52.8 by 10? And so that would just be 2.8. And we said that sometimes Python does a little bit of a weird rounding thing, right? So it'd be 2.79999999999. But as far as we're concerned, that's the 2.8 that we were looking for. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then the last thing that we said in the previous video, just briefly, I was sort of running out of time, so we were talking about this pretty quickly. But we were talking about this notion of a delimiter. Okay, so what a delimiter is a backslash in front of a double or single quotation. It is used to indicate to Python to print a double or single quotation when that syntax would coincide with the syntax that was used to begin and end the string to be printed. Okay, so that hopefully that's clear to you, but that's basically the clearest way it can be said, right? Is we said something like the, and then what you would need is if you wanted to say the A, right, in apple is the first letter of that word. So let's think about what this line of code would do. We're starting and ending a string, right? We said a string is the official word that we give to like a sentence or a collection of characters. We're starting and ending this string with double quotations, but we also hope to print double quotations. So then if we didn't have these delimiters, you can see they show up in orange as far as PyCharm goes. But if you don't have these delimiters here and you just said the A, it just cuts off that string. So it just print the, and then you would just have weird syntax here that Python wouldn't know what to do with. So you're just going to say that backslash means, hey, Python, I know that double quotes has a very special significance to you, but for the next one that's about to come up, I literally just want you to print that double quotes without ending the string that was started with double quotes. Okay, so now what you can do is you can go ahead and run it, and then it would just say the A in apple is the first letter of that word. And so there's no issue with that. And then the same thing would happen for, and if you wanted to not have ambiguity, you would just make the syntax different, right? So then if you just wanted to say the A in apple, then you need to start and end the string with single quotes, right? And then you know, you'd have the same kind of formulation here. So now if you go ahead and run the main method, it's just going to give us, it's two slightly different ways of doing the same thing. And delimiters also happen for single quotes. So what if you wanted to say, I bet that I can, what if you said print single quotes, right? That's not a great example, but here you're starting and ending the string with single quotes. And so if you put these backslashes here before these single quotes, it will print those single quotes rather than using those single quotes as an indicator to end the string, which is not what you'd want to have happen. So then that's the, that's what happens. And now you can print the single quotes there. That's called a delimiter. It's called a delimiter, and it's the last thing we talked about. So we're halfway through the 20 minutes. Let's talk about new content. What we're going to talk about now is an escape sequence, okay? So an escape sequence is basically a special character. So it's basically using a backslash to indicate that a following N or T will be used to print a new line or a new tab rather than the literal N or T. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to print pizza and then I'm going to have a backslash N and I'm going to say hot dogs. So this is pretty similar to the delimiter stuff that we were talking about up here. But what this does is instead of saying, hey, Python, I want you to print an N, right? Pizza and N hot dogs. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But what this backslash N does is if you put this in the context of a string, this is called an escape sequence. So we would say an escape sequence for a new line. And then what you would go ahead and do is you would go ahead and run it, and it would say pizza and hot dogs. And so you can also see, it looks like the hot dogs started at one space out because there was a space there. So now if you go ahead and remove the space, it just says pizza and hot dogs. This is called an escape sequence. And basically it just means that if you put a backslash N in the context of a print statement, then it'll just print a new line within the context of a string. So it's just going to say continue the string on the next line. And so that's totally fine. There's also one for tab, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to say we backslash T can backslash T tab backslash T out, okay? And so what this would do is it would separate the lines, the words of this string with tabs. And I think what's conventional in Python is for a tab to be considered 4 spaces, okay? So now what you do is you would go ahead and see little tabs there. It says we can tab out. And those tabs are relatively small, so I guess if you just wanted a little bit more spacing, you can just go ahead and run 2 consecutive escape sequences between each of the words, and then you get more spacing, right? So we can tab out, and then, if you say N and, print new lines, pretty cool, right? And so now you can just sort of combine and mix and match these escape sequences, right? And now you just wrote all this code with one line of code, right? And so it's going to underline something for pet purposes, right? And it's going to say you have an invalid escape sequence. So I don't know exactly what's happening with that, but you can choose to basically ignore errors that you don't understand. But I mean, I think that line of code will be fine. So then you can just go ahead and run it. And then you can see the tabs and the use of the escape sequence here. So hopefully that's clear to you, and hopefully you understand with what's going on. We can also print new lines by literally typing the words on new lines. But then what we need to do is start the print statement and end the print statement with 3 sets of double quotations. So here's what I mean by that. So hopefully you've internalized this. Remember, on the screen right here, we're talking about delimiters and we were talking about escape sequences. But we can also print new lines directly by doing that. So what we're going to say is we're going to have 3 sets of quotations, and then we're going to say what, and then literally what you can do is continue writing your string on the corresponding lines. And so this is an example of a multi-line print statement. If you give it 3 quotations, basically what you're saying is, hey, Python, I'm going to basically write a line of code, but it's going to spill out onto other lines of code, and I'm just going to need you to put it all together at the end of the day. So now if you go ahead and run the main file, it just says, what is your name? And it literally just printed those lines, right? You don't need to say print of what, print of is, print of your, print of name. That would have been the alternative. Or you could have had escape sequences. You could have said print of what backslash n is backslash n, your backslash n name, right? Or you just do print, quote, 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 what is your name? And then it'll literally print it as it sees it. So hopefully you can understand what's going on with that. There's only a couple other things to say about concatenations and basically how we combine strings and variables, okay? And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about data type conversions. And so we've already said that if you're going to combine an int and a floating point number, if we were talking about printing something like 8 times 10.0, we said that Python doesn't really like to combine or work with an int and a double. Those are 2 different data types. So the 8 would actually be converted to an 8.0, and then you'd be working with 8.0 times 10.0. So we're going to be talking about those data type conversions, because now we have to start talking about, we know how an int, and we know how a double is preferred over int, but what happens if strings come into play? So what if you tried combining a string with an integer? So we're going to try to see an example of that. It turns out that we have something in programming called concatenation. So that's a very fancy word, but basically what it means is basically you're combining strings. So you're basically combining values of words and letters into the same sentence essentially. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. What you're going to do is you're going to say pizza and then print and then you're going to have basically these addition symbols. So what this is going to do, it's not going to add numbers together, but basically we use this plus sign to combine two strings. So we're going to combine two strings and print them on the same line. Okay, so pizza and soda or something like that. And then what you do is you go ahead and run main.py, and it says pizza and soda, because what this plus sign does, it's not an addition, it's not adding, it's concatenating, it's combining those two strings, it's combining those three strings together. Okay, and you can do that even if the quotations, even if the syntax is different. So what if you said books, quote unquote, and then you can combine with a string that's in double quotations, then you could go back to single quotations. So you could say books and movies, and it would have no problem doing that, right? So just say books and movies, and you have to think about the number of spaces that's going to happen, right? Because you see a lot of spaces, but you just want to remember spaces, right? Because if you didn't have any in your code, then all these letters would literally just be meshed together, right? So then if you just do that, it's going to be books and movies, right? But then if you just want to have one space, then you would just need to be careful to just add one space, not between every set of punctuation, but just at the end of each line. And then you just go ahead and run it and you get books and movies. So that's what we have going on here. And then, but what you cannot do is you cannot combine with a string with an int. Okay, so we said basically, here's another difference between Java and Python. So in Java, an int is implicitly cast to a string. Okay, so combining an int with a string causes the int to turn into a string. Okay, and we saw examples, and you can go into like lessons 5 and 6 and 7. We were talking about that in the Java curriculum. In Python, we cannot concatenate an int with a string. So now if you go ahead and say, what if you try to say combine the number with 5 and then the word pizzas, and then we'd want to print 5 and then pizzas. But then if we go ahead and run it, it says that you can't combine an int with a string. And so in future videos, we're going to figure out basically methods and techniques for dealing with that. The last thing I want to say is that we can use, we use the addition sign here to combine two strings. It turns out that we can actually have multiple concatenation as well. So using the multiplication sign to concatenate the same string multiple times. So let me show you what I mean by that. There's going to be two quick examples that we do with this. So hopefully you understand the concatenation stuff, and I'm just going to remove this problematic line of code where we tried to concatenate an int with a string, because we said you can only concatenate strings with other strings, okay? And we're going to come up with a way to deal with that in future videos. But if you say something like cars and then times 5, what it would do is it would just print that string 5 times. So it'd say cars, 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 cars. And that's no problem. And you could go ahead and you can go ahead and do the int before the string if you want. So you could have said print of 10 times D, okay? And then it would just print 10 times letter D. So it would just basically concatenate D with itself 10 times. It's kind of intuitive, right? You can kind of guess that if the addition sign had the effect of combining strings, then presumably the multiplication sign would just have the effect of repeating that string that many times. And the same thing works for single quotations, okay? So you could say something like, hey, right? What if you do a hey \n in single quotes, and then you multiply that by the number 3 plus 1. So what's going to happen with this? It's going to evaluate 3 plus 1 to get 4, and it's going to print hey \n 4 times. But we said earlier in this video when we were talking about escape sequences that \n there has the effect of instructing Python to print a new line rather than printing the letter n. So that's why we get hey, 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 hey on 4 different lines, because we repeated this concatenation 4 times. So hopefully that was interesting. We talked a little bit more about arithmetic expressions, dealing with strings, talking about delimiters, how do we print quotations, how do we print new lines and tabs, and we'll be talking about variables in the next video, which are very important in programming. So from UMills03, thanks for watching and please subscribe.